The 2023 road season may not even have officially ended yet, but we're already getting excited about the first Grand Tour of 2024. Coming up, everything you need to know about next year's Giro d'Italia. Next year's Giro d'Italia will be the 107th edition of the race, and it will run from the 4th to the 26th of May. The first three stages will be in the Piemonte region, in the far northwest of the country, as was revealed last week, but the rest of the route includes some infamous climbs. Amongst them, Prati di Tivo, Monte Grappa twice, and the Stelvio. 3,321 kilometres in total, with just under 43,000 metres of climbing. There are two individual time trials next year, 7 stages in the high mountains, a finish in Rome, and some white gravel roads. I will get onto that shortly, but let's start at the beginning, shall we? The race begins in Torino with the shortest opening road stage since 2013, but one that's a lot punchier over its 136 kilometres. There's very little chance that this will be contested by a sprinter, with 3 categorised climbs that get progressively harder. The first of those is the Avezzano di San Pietro, then it's onto the Superga, a climb very familiar to those of you who've watched Milano-Torino, in which it regularly features. However, it will be far more poignant on a day that will mark exactly 75 years since a plane crash that took the lives of many of the champions of the Grande Torino football team in 1949. From there, they will descend back into Torino, where they'll be greeted by the third and final climb of the day, the Colle Maddalena. This will be tackled from the opposite side to 2021, where Simon Yates took the stage win. Climb itself, 6.1 kilometres at 7.4%, and with just under 20 k's of mainly downhill roads from the top to the finish, it will ensure that the GC riders have to come out swinging from the very first day. And they will have to continue swinging 24 hours later on stage 2 on what will be the earliest summit finish of the race since 1989. That year it was Mount Etna, next year it's Oropa, a climb made famous by Marco Pantani in the controversial 1999 edition, but one that has been used more recently as well. In 2017, Tom Dumoulin rode to what was a surprise victory at that point in time, but one that wasn't so surprising in hindsight as he went on to win the race overall. It's a long climb at just under 12 kilometres, but with an average gradient of just over 6%, it's quite likely we'll see a sprint amongst a handful of the GC contenders and climbers at the race. Meanwhile, the sprinters at the race will have to wait until stage 3 for their first potential opportunity and what will be the longest stage of the race to that point, 165 kilometres. It starts in Novara and finishes in Fossano. That said, it's not exactly a flat finish. Apparently it's the same road used in the final of the Giro del Piemonte in 2009, where Philippe Gilbert outsprinted a group of puncheurs, so maybe one for the stronger sprinters, perhaps. Stage 4 starts in Piemonte in Acqui Terme, but it heads out of the region after about 30 kilometres and into Liguria. The main climb of the day comes at the midway point of the 188 kilometre stage, and that is called the Colle della Molegno, a climb that was used at 1965 Milan-San Remo. And it will be onto the familiar Ligurian coastline from that race that they'll then head to, tracking it from Savona and to the finish line in Andora. Just before that finish line is the Capomelle. Again, familiar to those of you who've watched Milan-San Remo, as it's the first of the Tre Capi that preceded Cipressa and Poggio. In this stage though, the Capomelle peaks with 2 kilometres to go, so it's going to be a fast and frantic finish to that stage. There are more climbs to be dealt with on stage 5. The first of them is the third category Passo del Bracco, a climb that was used on stage 11 of this year's race, which was won by Pascal Ackermann. That day they finished in Tortona. This time they'll be heading to Lucca in Tuscany, a place where Mark Cavendish used to live and train. And with just a 4th category climb in the second half of that stage, this will almost undoubtedly be a big bunch sprint. The last time Lucca hosted a stage finish at the race was back in 1985, where it was the final day's individual time trial won by Francesco Moser. The race remains in Tuscany for stage 6, and while they're in Tuscany, why not take on some gravel roads? That's right, stage 6 is the Stirato stage, with 3 sections of Strade Bianche, though not sections that are used by the race of the same name. There's going to be a total of 11.2 kilometres of gravel over 3 segments that day, the hardest of which is the second one, which climbs to Grotti, which is exactly what it will be if it happens to be raining that particular day. The final sector finishes with around 14 k's to go to the finish, which is located in Rapolano Terme, with mostly steady uphill gradients on the way to that line. Really looking forward to that one already, I've got to admit. On to stage 7 then, which is the first of the 2 individual time trials. This one is 37 kilometres long from Foligno to Perugia, and whilst flat for the most part, the final 5Ks are predominantly uphill. It climbs a total of around 250 metres in that time, including a particularly steep opening part. It's the first of 2 big days for the GC riders as they're into the high mountains proper on stage 8, 153 Ks from Spoleto to Prati di Tivo. The stage starts on an uncategorised climb, so perfect for the non-GC climbers to get into the day's breakaway, and after a descent heads up the Forca Capistrello, 16.3 kilometres at 5.6% with a maximum of 12. From there, they're on rolling terrain until the foot of the Croce Abbio, a 3rd category climb, and then there's the sting in the tail. Prati di Tivo is 14.6 kilometres long with an average gradient of 7%. Now, it's only been used once at the Giro d'Italia, and that was all the way back in 1975, but it has been used 3 times in more recent years at Tirreno Adriatico. The last of those in 2021, Pogacar took the win, and Van Aert did enough to stay second on GC. It's not the biggest day in the mountains of this Giro d'Italia, but it'll almost certainly shake up the GC. Stage 9 will mark the end of the first block of racing, and it's the second longest of the race by distance, if not by duration. 206 relatively flat kilometres from Avezzano to Napoli. There are a few lumps and bumps over the final 40 kilometres, but only 1 classified climb. Perhaps not the big day that you'd hope to have for a Sunday afternoon in front of the television. After the first rest day, the race will then resume at the most southerly point of this year's route in Pompei, which last hosted a stage start in 1974. It's another flat start to the stage, but they'll then tackle the Campo just after the midway point before heading to another summit finish. This one is the Cusano Mutri, or Bocca della Selva. It's a climb that they went down in 2021. You may remember that Fernando Gaviria crashed out of the breakaway on that particular descent, whilst Victor Lafay went on to take the stage win. At 17.9 kilometres, it is long, but at 5.6% not particularly steep, especially by Giro d'Italia standards. The sprinters will have another opportunity on stage 11, which is the second of 4 stages over 200 kilometres long. This one heads to Francavilla al Mare in the Abruzzo region. The first half of the stage is rolling, but the second half is flat, tracking northwards up the Adriatic coast. And it's that coastline that they'll be tracking for the most part as they head further north on stage 12. But there are a few significant deviations inland. There are 5 4th category climbs and plenty more that are uncategorised. Now, I haven't seen full details yet as to whether or not there are any super steep gradients, but with plenty of their renowned Muri in that particular area, I would not bet against it. What follows is the flattest stage that you are ever likely to see. 179 kilometres from Riccione to Cento with a maximum altitude of 38 metres above sea level. Safe to say, this is another one for the sprinters, even if there is the off chance that the wind might blow in the right direction to split the peloton. Stage 14 is also fairly flat, but there's a key difference. It's the second of the 2 individual time trials. 31 kilometres from Castiglione delle Stiviere to Descenso del Garda. Definitely one for the time trial specialists, but obviously we are yet to learn which of them are going to be at the race. Either way, it'll be another important day for the GC, as will stage 15. At a whopping 220 kilometres, this is a proper Giro epic stage. It starts in Manerba. They take on 2 categorised climbs in the first 65 kilometres. Then a long valley road takes them to Aprica, and shortly after the descent of that climb, they're into Switzerland for a proper altitude fest and test. The first climb is the Foccala di Livigno. 18 kilometres is the official distance on the graphics, but really the climb is much, much longer than that. Over 30 kilometres in total, in fact. It takes them from 400 metres above sea level to over 2,300 metres and back over the border into Italy. But unfortunately for the riders, that isn't the highest point of that stage. The descent from that climb is short and takes them into Livigno, which is 1,850 metres above sea level. And then they tackle the Mottolino. 8.3k, 6.9%, but with an 18% kicker with just over 1k to go. Somewhat surprisingly, whilst Livigno is a regular haunt for pro cyclists looking to get in some altitude training, the Giro hasn't visited that town since 2005. They're going to be glad of the rest the next day, particularly when they see what's in store for them when they resume on stage 16. It's another epic. They start in Livigno, and that means that they might have done a mini altitude camp on the rest day, but after starting uphill, it's a long descent into Bormio. And when I mention that town, I'm sure you know what comes next. Yes, it is the Passo dello Stelvio, a monster of a climb and being used at the race for the first time since 2020, but for the first time in this direction since 2017. Now, coming so early in such a long stage, it's quite hard to see it having a bearing that it normally does. But nevertheless, it will be the Cima copy of this year's race, peaking at 2,758 metres above sea level. After the descent, there's close to 100 kilometres of flat or steadily downhill roads to the foot of the penultimate climb. That is the Passo Pinne, over 23 kilometres long, but with a far from savage gradient of 4.7%. A very short descent leads them to the summit finish of the Monte Panna, 7.3 k's at 5.5%, but the last 2 k's average 12. So a tough finish to what will be a very long day in the saddle, even for the best climbers. Think about the sprinters at the back. And those sprinters, having hauled their larger frames over the Stelvio and all the other climbs that day, will face a second successive nightmare on stage 17. That'll be the third and final time that the race heads over 2,000 metres above sea level, and that point comes straight out of the blocks. The Passo Sella looms large for them from kilometre 0. Now, strangely, it's only given second category status, even though it's 9 k's long and 7.5% average gradient. 4 more categorised climbs follow, including the Passo Rolle and the Passo del Broccon. 11.9 k's at 6.5% of their official stats, but there's a 3k section with constant double-digit gradients. It's a climb that was used on the first stage of last year's Tour of the Alps, but I'm pretty sure it's never been used at the Giro d'Italia in the past. A pretty intense stage, that one, at just 159 kilometres. For the sprinters who have managed to get through to that point, they'll have an opportunity on stage 18, 166 kilometres to Padova in the Veneto region, with a pan-flat second half to the stage. There are more mountains on stage 19, but I wouldn't say that they're particularly tough. Easy for me to say, sat in a comfy seat I know, but it doesn't look to me like it's going to make much of a difference on the GC. The final climb of the day is the Cima Sappada, 7.4 k's at 5.4%, and reasonably tough towards the top, but they'll still have 6 k's of fairly flat road from there to the finish. What follows is the pièce de résistance, or the pezzo forte, I guess, a final mountain stage that features not just one, but 2 ascents of the Monte Grappa. Now, this definitely could shake up the GC, and it's the last opportunity to do so, as it's the penultimate stage of the race. The climb itself is 18.1 k's long, 8.1% average gradient, and has featured over the last couple of years at the Adriatica Ionica race. Last time it was used at the Giro, though, was in 2017, but from the opposite side. But they did use this side in the individual time trial in 2014. Nairo Quintana won that day en route to overall victory. From the second ascent, there's about 30 k's of descending into the finish line at Bassano del Grappa, although there's a bit of a kick midway down that particular descent. Whatever the state of play on GC by the end of stage 20 is almost certainly not going to change on the final day, and so that is where the winner will be crowned. They'll take a flight down to Rome, as they did last year, for a final stage that has 6 laps around the capital city over a distance of 126 kilometres. So there you have it. Initial thoughts on my side. Love the gravel inclusion, although I know it's not for everyone. Also like that they are continuing to include a fair few time trialling kilometres in an era where that discipline seems to be going out of fashion. I would have liked to have seen 1 or 2 more of the really famous climbs in Italy, and I would have preferred the Stelvio to come at a point where it might have had more of a bearing on things. The race is definitely punchier. It's a couple of 100 kilometres short of the average distance of the race in the first 2 decades of this century, and it's the shortest Giro d'Italia since 1979. That was a year when there were only 19 stages, and 5 of them were individual time trials. The organisers are clearly trying to make the race more appealing to a modern audience, and I'm all for that, particularly as we still have a couple of characteristically epic stages in the mountains. But as always, it is the riders that make the race, so hopefully that's exactly what they'll do. The question is, which riders will be there to make the race? Well, at this point, we don't know. We know that Evenepoel is concentrating on the Tour de France next year, and it's likely that Vingegaard and Roglic will too. There have, however, been a few rumours that Pogačar might be tempted to ride the Giro next year, but with the Tour de France coming a week earlier than normal due to the Olympics, doubling up with that would have been even harder than it is on a normal year. So we'll have to wait and see. I wouldn't be at all surprised if Sepp Kuss went there as a designated leader of Jumbo-Visma in what would be his 6th Grand Tour in a row. Right, let me know your thoughts on next year's route in the comment section down below. What do you like most? What's missing for you? I look forward to reading your views on the route. Just 7 months now to wait until the start in Turin, although I'm sure it will go by in a flash. That is all for now then. See you for the Racing News Show on Monday.